Beyond Resilience is a series of curated conversations created by Firelight.
Beyond Resilience does a lot to keep people connected and keep people talking about films or talking about issues, connecting our filmmakers and other filmmakers together.
We wanted to create a space where our community, that is BIPOC documentary filmmakers, could lead a conversation.
We have to do a better job of knowing that films aren't just what we can physically see on the screen. It's about the people that put in the blood, sweat, and tears behind the scenes.
Knowing that what you're so passionate about, someone looks at as unmarketable or niche. Who's the audience for this? Who's going to care about this, right? And those simple things that people say are like daggers to you.
I think that is the part of the violence of the model minority shit, that it like shaves away our history of resistance, of rebellion, of ferocity.
We have always resisted. We have always fought back in many different forms.
It's an evolving form. You have to evolve or not you will stagnate.
You have to have intention to change, and you have to understand that you're not changing to try to give anybody a gift, but you're changing so that you can do your job better.
What we're asking for is just proportional access, proportional resources, proportional marketing money, so that it does actually meet its mission, so that it does actually lean into the diversity of perspectives.
I hope that Beyond Resilience will keep its edge, will keep pushing the boundaries of the conversations that we need to have, and will keep growing its audiences, pulling in new people from the industry, outside the industry. It continues to be a space where people can have a BIPOC creator-led conversation. That is what it's about.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Jonathan Kitt, Development Director for Firelight Media. Thank you for joining us for this Beyond Resilience Masterclass event on Black filmmakers owning and telling our history. The Masterclass substrand of our Beyond Resilience series is made possible by the National Endowment for the Humanities. This series of 4 masterclasses aims to highlight how films and filmmakers in partnership with humanities scholars have the power to educate the public about our shared history. I'm a Black man with shoulder-length locks wearing a black shirt. I'd also like to start with a land acknowledgement to raise awareness of Indigenous history and land rights, and to express our intention to stand in solidarity with Indigenous people. I am in Harlem on the land of the Munsee Lenape people. We all have a responsibility to consider what it means to acknowledge the history and legacy of colonialism and genocide. I would encourage you to make land acknowledgements in the chat. Our chat moderator will drop a link where you can click and learn whose ancestral lands you live on. Beyond Resilience is also supported in part by the Open Societies Foundations, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs and New York City Council, the National Endowment for the Arts, and Field of Vision. We'd also like to thank the generous community of individuals and organizations whose support directly benefits our growing community of filmmakers. If you'd like to make a donation in support of our work, please use the link in the chat or use our brand new text to give option. You can text the word LIGHT to 801-801 right now to make a tax deductible contribution. Again, that number is 801-801 and the word is LIGHT. We appreciate your support. Also, thank you to Mara Bassani Santamaria and Nicole Panciano for your ASL interpretation services. Today's panel discussion centers around Black filmmakers who have used the documentary medium to tell historical narratives. Their films clarify, challenge, or otherwise enhance previously held truths about the subjects and cultural moments pertinent to the understanding of Black history in the United States. To explore this important conversation with these esteemed panelists, we've invited Cameo George, executive producer of American Experience, to moderate the panel. Cameo has an extensive history in the film and media industry. Prior to her role as executive producer of WGBH's historical documentary strand, American Experience, Cameo oversaw development of ABC News originals. She was head of video and TV for Aussie Media and also served as a producer for Firelight Films. We are thrilled to have her guide us through what I know will be an informative, provocative, and inspiring conversation, especially as we kick off this masterclass series. Lastly, I'd like to thank today's audience who sent in nearly 60 questions in advance of the event. Those questions have informed the development of today's program, and we very much appreciate your interest and enthusiasm. So now I'll turn it over to Cameo George, who will introduce the rest of today's panelists.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you all for joining us. My visual description: I'm a Black woman with Black hair, wearing long beaded earrings and a red top. As I introduce today's panel participants and read their brief bios, I welcome attendees to share questions for the participants in the Q&A panel at any time. There will be time set aside for audience questions at the end of the event. And now to introduce today's panelists. Stanley Nelson: his films combine compelling narratives with rich historical detail to shine new light on the underexplored American past. Awards received over the course of his career include a MacArthur Genius Fellowship, 5 Primetime Emmy Awards, and Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Emmys and the International Documentary Association. He recently earned his first Oscar nomination for his highly acclaimed documentary, Attica. His films for public media include The Black Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution, and American Experience films Freedom Riders and The Murder of Emmett Till, all of which will inform today's discussion. Next, Dawn Porter is an award-winning documentary filmmaker whose work includes the historical documentaries John Lewis, Good Trouble, and Spies of Mississippi. Her work has appeared on HBO, PBS, Discovery, and Netflix, among others. Her credits include directing and executive producing an Apple TV multi-part documentary series with Oprah Winfrey and Prince Harry, which focuses on both mental illness and mental well-being. Dawn is the founder of the production company Trilogy Films and is an alum of Firelight's Documentary Lab. Roger Ross Williams is an award-winning director, producer, writer, and the first African-American director to win an Academy Award for his short doc, Music by Prudence. His film, Life Animated, was nominated for an Academy Award and won 3 Emmys in 2018, including the award for Best Documentary. He's created films for Amazon, Facebook Oculus, Netflix, and more via his production company, One Story Up. His recent series, High on the Hog, was awarded a Peabody Award just this week and will return for season 2 on Netflix. And finally, Sam Pollard is an American film director, editor, producer, and screenwriter of films including MLK FBI, Eyes on the Prize, and Bamboozled. His films have garnered numerous awards such as Peabody's, Emmys, and an Academy Award nomination. In 2020, Sam was honored with a Career Achievement Award by the International Documentary Association. To sum up Sam's work, Henry Louis Gates Jr. is credited as saying, "When I think about his documentaries, they add up to a corpus, a way of telling African American history in its various dimensions." So let's just jump right in. I'm really happy to be here with all of you. The audience I know is in for a treat. Having all of you on one stage is quite incredible. I would love to start off with the question that is really the foundation for today's conversation. And that's, why is it important who makes historical films about a particular subject? And is a Black filmmaker's take on a historical subject unique? I would love to start with Stanley.
I think it's really important, who makes any film. I think there's thousands of decisions that are made, on each film. Every day in the edit room, how you shoot, what you shoot. I think that, for myself, my stories are informed because I'm part of the African American community. I was raised there. It's the community that I know. So I think that it really does matter. One of the things that I feel is that people should tell their own story. And again, it's not as a gift, but I think that people can tell their own story in a much deeper and much more nuanced, much wholer way than people from outside the community.
Mhm. And Stanley, we had a conversation maybe a year ago, and we talked about this question. And I asked you, should non-BIPOC filmmakers uh, be commissioned to make films about BIPOC communities? And you did not hesitate, and you just said no, and that was the end. And it was, it made me laugh, not because it's funny, but because you were just so emphatic. And I remember the audience really had a strong reaction to that, because there were filmmakers of all races, genders, classes in the audience, and there were people who were like, I want to be able to tell any story, and I should be able to. But you really feel strongly, yes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that I felt when you asked that question is that if it's a yes or no question, the answer is no. I mean, and we could go into it, a lot deeper than that. But I think that to put it simply, it would be better if people tell their own story, and there's a lot of stories that filmmakers who aren't of color can tell, and they can tell well, and that they should tell those stories. Now, again, it's a lot more nuanced than that. I mean, anybody can tell any story they want, but it's also, who has access to the money, who has access to the gatekeepers, and I grew up in a time where there were very few films or no films that were made, by African Americans. I mean, that's why historical films. That's why Eyes on the Prize, was such a groundbreaker, because it was a film that was made, from African Americans at the top, and that was something very different. And I think because of that, it looked at history in a very different way.
Mm-hmm. And I'd love to turn to Sam, because Stanley brought up Eyes on the Prize. You notably worked on Eyes on the Prize as well. How do you feel about this question? Do you think that there is something special that is gained when a person of a particular community tells a story, makes a film about that community, or does it matter?
I think it's a little more complicated. I think one of the things to remember is that Stanley's right. I mean, 25 years ago, there were less filmmakers of color making films about our communities. And I think it's important now that the gatekeepers, those who have the money, the Netflixes and the HBOs and the Showtimes, understand that if they're going to be stories about the African American community or the Latino community or the gay community, that they need to be thinking and looking at filmmakers who can do that. But that doesn't, from my perspective, preclude anybody from telling our stories. Now, I would say this very clearly. There's some films that I can make that another Black filmmaker or a filmmaker of color could make that'll have a different take. So to me, it's always understanding that the perspective is different. I was mentored by St. Clair Bourne, who told me way back in the early 80s that we had to tell our stories. And I took that to heart. But I also understand that, if a filmmaker comes to me who's not my color, but who understands my community in a way that may be different than how I see it, I'm going to support that filmmaker if I think they have the right attitude. So I'm not as a no. I wouldn't say no like Stanley would say. I'm never going to say no, because to me, a filmmaker can make a story, can tell a story. It's just how genuine and how serious they are. It's like, for example, I'm finishing up a film about Max Roach now. Now, do I think I'm the only person who can tell Max Roach's story? Part of me says yes, but there's another part of me that says, no, it's more complicated than that. If the person loves jazz like I love jazz, understands the nuances of jazz like I understand nuances, they can tell that story. They could be white, yellow, or green, as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Roger, I'd love for you to jump in. I know that you have in the past and continue to work on a number of high profile projects with multicultural teams, mixed teams. What's your perspective on this question?
Well, I think there's a big correction that has to happen now in the doc industry, for because for so long, we weren't telling our stories. Others were parachuting into our communities and sort of telling a story that perpetuated a certain type of racist idea about African Americans. And I think this is a time, that after George Floyd, the reckoning in America, things started to shift from the buyers, and they're starting to recognize that we need to, of course, we need to tell our own stories. But again, just like Stanley and Sam has said, it's been about access for filmmakers of color. Black filmmakers haven't had access to the buyers, to we haven't had the gatekeepers. So I mean, I think that's starting to change, but it's also still a big problem. So I think we need to sort of correct that. We need to educate the buyers, and also there needs to be some of those gatekeepers need to change. Gatekeepers need to be gatekeepers of color who understand that, and that's a that's a big battle right now that we're having.
Hmm. Hmm. And so, Don, I'd love to go to you next. One of the things that's so interesting to me about you and your career is that you came to film as a second career. Were you motivated to enter this arena because you didn't see enough representation on the maker side? And can you talk about that, please?
Yeah, I really was. It's a joy to be here with so many people I respect so much and call friends, you included. And so thank you for gathering us. But I was a lawyer, and I was working first for ABC News and then for A&E Television, and then just, a consumer of media. And the stories that were being told about people who look like all of us were not by people who look like all of us, but what also more important, they weren't telling a full story. They weren't telling the story of people I came across every day who are smart and resilient and interesting and funny and not, always subject to the same kind of poverty conditions that was just, being shown. So, but I do think what you're seeing in this conversation is a positive development and the passage of time. I think, you know, Stanley and then, also Sam really had to bust down some doors in order to make work. And I think that is we are no longer, I think, operating from such a perspective and such a place of scarcity. And by scarcity, I don't just mean resources for projects, but I also mean I don't know that any longer it's the case that there's only going to be one shot at telling a story. And so if if there's more opportunity opening up, I think what buyers and certainly what audiences are seeing is that they appreciate who the maker is, and they appreciate what that maker brings to a story. Some filmmakers that I respect a lot who, like I saw, film about Alanis Morissette that said that she influenced Beyonce. And I was like, no, that's just no. And I think, this is a great filmmaker and a person I love and respect. And I'm like doing a cover of a song is not the same as being an influencer. So I also think, but it's important to me. A couple of things that I want to add to this is we need to have more filmmakers who are getting these jobs, and the four of us here can't do all the jobs, even if we wanted to, which is not what any of us are about. And so the important thing is to um, make sure that this door is pried open even wider. And I think every single person on this panel, I see every single one of us doing what we can to bring the person up who doesn't have the credits or the name
or the reputation. And so, some people call it the black tax, like you got to do the extra work for your community. But, in some ways it's a tax that I think we willingly take on because we know how important it is to me to have people who came before me, and how important it is to me to make sure I'm not the last of anything. And so I think that's that's a big thing for all of us to be thinking about.
There were a lot of nods as you were saying that, and I think that all of you on the panel, I know just that you feel strongly about that and creating opportunity. Stanley, anytime anyone talks about creating opportunity for filmmakers of color, my mind automatically goes to Firelight. I had the privilege of working with you and the team at Firelight for a short period. But just as someone in this space, we have all watched and marveled at what you've been able to achieve. Can you talk about it seems like an obvious question, but about why Firelight exists, and particularly talk about the Doc Lab, since Dawn brought that up. As I said, she's a fellow, and this idea of pulling up the next generation and people behind you.
Yeah, I think that the Doc Lab came out of the fact that um, s- what did Don call it? The black tax. That um, so many African American documentary filmmakers, um, it was 15 years ago or so, were doing that extra work to mentor people. Sam, so many others were doing that work, and we really wanted to institutionalize it. And say, there there can be kind of like an institute to do this work. When I was coming up, and this is a long time ago, it was in the 70s, and there were these government programs, and, WNET had a program, and other TV stations had a program to get more people of color and more diverse people into the industry. Well, now in this country, all those things are pretty much gone. And so we were thinking, how can we do this and build it so that it's really something and that it can last. And we started with kind of two ideas. One was that there were great filmmakers. There were great filmmakers of color who were out there with great ideas for films, and that was just an idea. And the other idea was that we could raise money to keep this thing going and to get the lab going. I think that one of the things that we found in some ways very easily was that there were a lot of talented filmmakers. The money part was a little bit harder. Because I think I didn't really think it through that when you make a film, you raise money for the film. It's as hard as it is. Once you get the money, then you make the film and it's done. But we didn't kind of think it through that with something like the Doc Lab, it's a constant fundraising piece. So we're constantly raising money to keep the lab going. But it's in like the 12th, 13th, 14th year or something like that, and we just are finding great filmmakers, and they're making great films, and we try to just do what we can to help them make the films, but it's really on the filmmakers.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'd like to switch tacks a little bit because it's a masterclass and you are all masters of your craft. I think our audience is really interested in hearing about how you got into the field and perhaps what you consider was your breakthrough project. So I'd love to go around. I'll start with Sam, actually.
Stanley mentioned the programs in the 70s, and I was very fortunate that in 1971, WNET had a film and television workshop to get more people of color behind the camera in the editing room. And I joined that program when I was 21. And I learned to make little films. And out of that program, which was 1 year, 2 nights a week, professionals would come in and teach us how to shoot, how to edit, how to write scripts, how to take sound. I gravitated toward the editing, and I got very lucky. After that 1 year, I got hired as an apprentice editor on a feature film directed by the late Bill Gunn titled Ganja and Hess. And I was the apprentice, and the editor, a gentleman named Victor Konevsky, took me under his wing, and I became his assistant. And probably the breakthrough film for me was a film that I co-edited in 1983 called Style Wars, about graffiti and hip hop in New York City. And that was sort of like, for me as an editor, a big moment. That was it for me.
And Dawn, you spoke.
And I know Stanley since the 70s.
Love to hear that. Love to hear that. Dawn, you spoke about changing careers, starting in law, moving over to film. How were you able to make that transition? Like, who gave you an opportunity, or what motivated you to say, like, I am doing this? Like, what was your first shot?
I mean, like all of us, like no one gave me the opportunity. I chose myself. I was like, you know what? You know who would be good? You. So I was a lawyer. I was not an unhappy lawyer. I moved to ABC News from a law firm after working there for 5 years. And I was doing network standards. I had both my kids. I moved to A&E television. And between ABC, where because of the job I was doing, which was really reviewing controversial stories for ethical questions, journalism questions, it was always breaking news stuff. So I would have to go sit and watch the editors. And once you see what people do, it's not so mysterious. And I think a lot of us, because if you're in the Black community, you often are assumed to be not skilled. A lot of us have that. We got to be perfect. We've got to go to film school. We've got to know all the things so that people can't doubt us. And that is another part of the Black tax. And so by sitting for 8 years watching editors and producers and people writing stuff, I was like, this isn't like rocket science. I could do this. And so that was where the seed was planting that I could do it. And then when I went to A&E, it was right when reality television was exploding. And then, lo and behold, it turns out reality wasn't so real, because real, as we all know, takes many years. And TV doesn't have any time for that. So I thought I was seeing a lot of like cops, like Black people with their hands behind their back and their faces shoved into a cop car. And I thought there's just a lot more. So when I went to a lot of film festivals, which I highly encourage. If you're going to invest in yourself, you got to go where the people are, where the people making the work are. And so there's film conferences, go to screenings, go if you're lucky enough to live in a city with a festival, go to the films, mingle with the people, see what people are talking about, see what people are doing, and then see if you can see yourself participating in that. And then, it really starts with an idea. So I met the public defenders, and, that was my first film, and I got a big grant, and that really allowed me to start to think of this as a career and not just, a one-off project.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Roger, can you share with us what you consider your breakthrough and how you got your start in this industry as well?
Yeah. Well, like Dawn, this is my second career. So I was a journalist and I worked for all the major networks, for CBS, for ABC for a long time, and CNN. And I got just frustrated with working for the man, working for mainstream media. I and I just made a decision that I was going to make a film, and I was just going to do it. And I didn't go to film school. I went to journalism school, but I quit my job at CNN, and I decided I was going to make a film in Africa, and I was going to I'd never been to Africa. And I was like, I just took all the money I had, hopped on a plane and went to Zimbabwe. And because I had heard this story about this amazing singer, disabled singer named Prudence Mabena, and I just landed on the ground, had no idea really what I was doing, and just started filming with her. And the first day I started filming with her, I remember the first interview, and this is the first interview, and I started to cry, and I was like, "This is the greatest story of my life." And um, I took, that risk paid off, and we went on to the win the Oscar, and I, but it was a long struggle making that film. It was, getting grants. It was begging for money, and then uh, HBO came on, and that was really my big break and Sheila Nevins, who's the head of HBO at the time. She said to me the first time she saw any footage, she said, "This film is going to win an Oscar." Um, and but it has to be a short. And Sam was my advisor, and I wanted it to be a feature. And Sam's like, "It's a short." And I was I was just kicking and screaming and fighting. And I was like, "No, it's a feature. It's a feature." And then Sam made me realize that it was stronger as a short, and him and Sheila were right. So that was my big breakthrough. Yeah.
Mhm. That's wonderful, and it just once again
Thank you, Sam.
speaks
I
to,
owe it to you. I owe it all to
yeah,
Sam.
I love that. I mean, I think that just really speaks to the power of mentorship, right? And this network that we develop, and the connections. Dawn is talking about going to festivals, going to screenings. Roger, you're talking about the power of having a trusted advisor. Stanley, you're talking about the Doc Lab and how it's about, each one teach one. I think it is something that is special, that occurs in our community. Not to say that other people don't have mentors and sponsors, but it is more meaningful, I think, in our community, because as each of you have mentioned, this historic inability to get in the door, right? And the gatekeepers don't necessarily look like us, don't necessarily understand the power of our stories. This question is for each of you, or for any of you. Um, why do you think that has changed, or do you think that that's changing? I mean, I certainly know we don't think it's changing fast enough, but why do you think that, or do you think that there is more opportunity now for filmmakers of color? How has it changed?
I think that for those of us who are seasoned, experienced professionals like Don, myself, Stanley, Roger, Raul Peck, definitely the doors are really opening. I mean, all of us have lots of work now. The biggest challenge I see is for the younger filmmakers of color to really get a step up and to get these gatekeepers to give them the money to make films. And I think that part of the responsibility we have, and part of the responsibility of Firelight, which has done such a great job, is to help these young filmmakers get through these doors to help make their documentaries. When Stanley and I were coming up, when I first came up, the only filmmaker of color I really was aware of was Saint, and then I met Stanley and I met a few others. But there wasn't like a group of us. Now there's more of us. There's Charlotte Lynch. There's so many others. Many others now. But I think we still have the responsibility to help the younger generation get their foot in the door. Excuse me.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I really agree with that. Yep. Oops, sorry, Stanley.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
Age before beauty.
Well, then you should go. Go ahead, Dawn. I'm not gonna say nothing.
I was just going to say that I really agree with that. And, recently there's a project that, people came to me with, and I was like, it's a South African story. And I was like, we should have somebody South African, preferably a Black woman in South Africa, make that film. And so I think what a lot of us end up doing is kind of not vouching, but standing next to people, and giving them whatever help they need. Sometimes they need a lot, sometimes they don't need so much. I will say though, what you can do if you're looking for help is listen to the help. And kind of my thing is like, spread very thin. I do as much as I can, but it's hard when you give like a precious hour of screening time to somebody's project and then they say no thank you. Like I appreciate Roger saying he fought, but he was he had a commission from a network. If you're trying to get that commission and you ask for advice from some of us, like you should really be prepared to take it, and I know that that's a hard thing to manage sometimes, but just think of you're not the only person asking for advice. And so we're trying to do as much as we can, but your part is to to be a listener.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both Dawn and Sam. I think that one of the things that we run into at the lab is again that the gatekeepers. Film is very expensive, and the gatekeepers want something that's guaranteed. So a lot of times we run into people who go through the lab and make a great film that premieres at Sundance or Tribeca and wins awards, but they have a hard time getting the next film made. And I think that that's something that people of color, it kind of stands out for people of color. A lot of times, they're thought of as you're not really a really good filmmaker. You happen to stumble upon a really good story, and and you made a really good film, and you're at Sundance, but it's hard to get the next one. But I think that again, that's just the way the industry works in some ways. We're trying to fight that. But I remember, I my first film was $2 in a Dream about Madam C.J. Walker that premiered on PBS, prime time. And then I made the next film, and it took me another 7 years to make that film, The Black Press. But William Greaves, who was kind of my mentor when I made my second film, one thing he said, he turned to me and said, well, they can't say that it was an accident now. You've done it twice. And so a lot of times, we just have to figure out how to fight through and get that next film made, because it's not easy, and one thing you have to remember is that film is expensive, and that whoever is commissioning the film or giving you grants or whatever, however the film is financed, it's a lot of money, and so you just have to kind of smile through it and keep chugging and believe in yourself and have that network of support, and I think that because I think that network is really helpful.
I think could I raise one other thing that's important in what Stanley's saying is film is not only expensive, but it's a business. And as part of a business, you are not just an artist. Like, I don't know anybody who's sitting around waiting to make your dreams come true. So, you have to think about all of the things and film companies, believe it or not, are conservative. They would rather know that you're going to deliver something that's fine, on budget, and on time than that you're going to do that lightning in a bottle, because that's an expensive dart for them to throw at a dartboard. So a thing that you can do for yourself is learn how to be a good business partner. And if that's not your thing, surround yourself. Nobody makes a film by themselves. So, if you will see, like Roger and I recently have both started our own production companies. Stanley's had his company and Firelight for a while. Sam is an editor. So he was always going to have job security because how many titles did you give Sam? He does like all the things. So, but if you don't do all the things like Sam, then you have to make sure that you build the infrastructure. You're not going to necessarily march into someone else's infrastructure and have it adapt to you. So if that's what's important to you, then you should figure out how to build the infrastructure that you want, and I think people aren't necessarily, and my first film, Gideon's Army, premiered at Sundance, won an award. I could not get money for a second film. Could not get money. And so I just like did the research for it and da 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 da, and until I got $5,000 to make what would become my next feature, which was Trapped, which also went to Sundance and also won a prize. But I couldn't get that money for that second film. So, you know, like this is the business, and crying about it is fun at bars, not really, but that's not going to help you. What's going to help you is fighting through that, and so I just wanted to give some more support for what Stanley's saying about the fighting through is not yelling and complaining. It's figuring out how to solve the problem of that is in front of you. Is it money? Is it access? Is it time? Like, think of each of these things as the puzzle to solve. Think of them one at a time and solve for that one. And that's a productive use of your annoyance or anger or frustration. It is not productive for you to just go around and drink with your friends, because nobody cares that you're drinking with your friends. I mean, I drink with Roger all the time.
I just add one.
Well,
I just add one thing to that, Sam, because it's directly related to that, and I think that I had a number of films in a row with American Experience, and we had a new associate producer who was working with us, and she went to one of the fine cut screenings. And we came out, and she said, I've never been to a screening like that. You didn't yell, you didn't complain, you just nodded your head, yes, and left. And I said, yeah, well, I'm not going to sit there and argue with them. I mean, like, why? I hear what they say, and and a lot of times people tell you things like, oh, you should do this, you should do that. But I'm trying to look at what the real problem is with the film and fix it. Because there is a problem. If somebody says that there's a problem, so I think that that's important. That just by my nature, I just like I'm not gonna get up in a screening and I argue with people about the film. Sam, you go ahead.
Yeah, I just think it's fantastic that both Stanley, Roger, and Dawn have these infrastructures now, to really make more than one film. I think it's fantastic. And I think it's really important for these people out there listening that understand exactly what Dawn is saying. It's not just about creating the art, but it's also business. And I just finished working on the project One Story Up with Roger and Jeff, and it was fantastic. I mean, they were great. They were supportive, and they helped us get through some trying times on this damn film. you know? So these infrastructures, what they're doing, what these folks are doing is something that we should all understand and take a lesson from, because that's how we're going to keep these films going. To have people like Dawn and Roger and Stanley with their infrastructures creating a body of work.
I think what both Dawn and I realized early on is that we need to sort of become the gatekeepers. We are the gatekeepers now. And as gatekeepers, because we have these companies, we can then educate the buyers. We can then vouch for these filmmakers. We can then hire filmmakers and teach them, and raise up these filmmakers. And we can, like one way to do that is if, like, when we do a series, we can say, okay, we want this filmmaker who may not have the credits or may have been stuck in reality television, because a lot of black directors got stuck there, and we could say we're vouching for them, and they're going to direct an episode. They're going to direct an episode of the 1619 Project or High on the Hog, and that was really important. And so now, because we had that sort of, business head, I think because Dawn is a lawyer and had that business head because I was a producer and worked in network television, we understood that. But I think Dawn is right that you got to understand the business of filmmaking, and it's not just about the art of filmmaking, it's also about the business of filmmaking. And you've got to, if you're going to make it in this business, you got to really be clear about the what the buyers need, what the trends are, what's going on, and how these films get produced. That's so key to success.
No, and
I
I think, oops, sorry. I just, last one thing about that, because I think it's so important, because people, first of all, I want to point out that Sam said he had struggles. And like that's important to say. Just because you have a sustainable career does not mean you're not still struggling with some problem, whether it's artistic or business or whatever. Like that's just going to be a constant. That's our business. If you're not made for that, you should get a direct deposit job, because, then you can rail against the man and cash that check and get your insurance. So that's not necessarily what our life is like all the time. But a companion to what Roger is saying is, I think, he's right. Like Roger and I were like housemates at a lab, like when for our first features, and like spent a lot of like time under the stars talking about like dreams and hopes and all the rest of it. And the other thing to what he's saying, which I agree with 100%, is know yourself. If you're not a person who loves business, I love business. I think that's part of the creativity. I love finding the right person for the right project. I feel that satisfaction about that. But if you're not that and you want to be an artiste, you still have to understand the marketplace in which you're working, and you still have to be open to listening, but you can align yourself with somebody who does enjoy it. There are trade-offs for every choice you make. If you choose to do business, it takes time away from your art. If you choose not to do the business, then you've got to share with the person who is doing the business, because your movie's not getting made without some business, participation. It's just not going to happen. So just be really honest with yourself about what you're good at, what you enjoy, and what you want out of. Do you want one film, or do you want a career? And those are different experiences. If you want a career, and you're looking to long-term build, then you make, certain choices based on that desire to have a career.
Mhm. Really important advice. So for each of you, speaking about the business and the choices that you make as filmmakers, but also as gatekeepers, as Roger said, each of you still direct, but you also executive produce, and you help other people get their projects made and bring them to the different streamers and networks and all of that. Is one more satisfying than the other? How do they serve? What do each of those roles serve for you in different ways? I'm curious to hear.
For me, they're all satisfying. Someone asked me a few weeks ago, do I do I feel I miss editing because I don't edit anymore? I said I love making movies. I love the idea of developing films. I love the idea of working on treatments. I love the idea of raising money. I love the idea of supporting young filmmakers. Cameo, like the young lady who did the film about the Black ambassadors. I supported her for like 4.5 years to get that film made. There's another film with these two filmmakers from upstate New York, Iron McKinley and Bowen Suchek, and they're doing a film about the Black community in Florida. I've been supporting those filmmakers for 2 or 3 years. To me, it's about the process. If I'm making a film myself, if I'm supporting a filmmaker, I enjoy it. I still love it as much as I did when I was just editing. To me, it's all about the same thing. It's not to say there's not challenges, as you heard me say to Roger about the last film I just co-directed with the Sacco Gladjo. But that's part of the business. Is what Dawn is saying. There's you never go into making a film knowing that everything's going to come up roses. You're going to have to fight every moment all the way, financially, creatively, artistically. And when Stanley said about when he was in a screening, one of the most invaluable things I learned as an editor that I've used as a director was when I would screen when I was a young editor and I would screen with my director, I would always be difficult. I would always fight. No, this doesn't make sense. I'm not going to do this. This is awful. I have learned over the years to do exactly what Stanley says. Go into a screening, keep my mouth shut, just listen. I don't agree all the time, but I'm just listening because what's the job? We're trying to make a really good film. And as Dawn said, it's a collaborative effort. No man's an island. I used to think I could make everything myself, but I know I've learned better, you know. So it comes from experience, and it comes from me wanting to believe that we have a responsibility. And Dawn said something really good early on. All this knowledge and all this experience I have, I don't want to take it to the grave. I want to pass it on to this next generation of filmmakers.
Yeah. You know, there's nothing more rewarding than seeing a film, executive producing or producing a film, and watching it blossom. You know, we have I don't know 14 or 15 feature films in production now, and one of our films that just won the grand jury prize at South by Southwest. All of those, everyone involved in that film as a first time filmmaker. The director, the DP, the editor, the assistant editor, everyone was a first-time filmmaker who the director came to me with a vision, and the DP is brilliant, and guiding them all through both the business side of it, but also through the creative process. And then when they're given that opportunity, they succeed and exceed, and they win grand jury prizes, and that's so rewarding to stand there at South by, and they just won San Francisco Film Festival grand jury, like and watch them, and they're just watching the joy on their faces as they take it all in, that all of their hard work and their talent paid off, is incredibly rewarding. So I love that side of the business as much as I do directing films. And is it tough to balance all of that? Yeah, it's really tough. And it's I'm not gonna lie, it's hard to do both, and you have to have a great team around you and great people around you, that and each project I'm directing, you have to build a great team around that, and a great sort of infrastructure with the company and great people. So yeah, it's not easy, and I'm sure Dawn will agree with it. You're stretched thin, but it's incredibly rewarding in the end, when you get to stand there with those filmmakers. And so I love it. I love both.
You know how you learn something by watching somebody else's mistakes? That's also part of it. It's nice not to have it feel like bet the farm. And when you can stand back and have a little bit of distance, and helpfully help somebody solve a problem that seems insurmountable to them, but you know that you can be helpful. I think it not only helps them, but it helps me. It helps me become a better filmmaker. And it's kind of like, it's definitely what Stanley is saying. So it takes a long time to learn to not argue with people's opinions. And, so like what I've definitely learned is, if people are suggesting a change or something, they're pointing to an area that needs work. Maybe they don't have the solution. You don't have to listen to the solution, but they're pointing to something to look at. And so I learned so much from watching other people, and I do find the same satisfaction. And also, I find a satisfaction in saying, like, they're going to make their own mistakes, but hopefully they won't make the same mistakes I made. Maybe I can short circuit some of those things, and make friends and see people grow. One thing that has been incredibly satisfying to me is watching our assistant editors. I had an assistant editor on 2 projects, and now he's editing a feature for me. And he's so hardworking and so deserving. No one would have given him a feature film for a major network. Nobody. And I was like, this is my editor. And they were like, okay, this is your editor. So there's a lot of satisfaction in that. And by the way, he's killing it. It's like, I was just sitting there thinking, I'm like, he's going to get hired by everybody else now because, he's so good. I'm not telling you, of all people. His name is John Smith. Go look it up.
That's great. So we are actually scheduled to take a quick 5-minute break. So we'll take a short break because we still have a lot to talk about. When we come back from the break, I'd love to dig in more on historical doc making itself and just some of the questions and issues that you each grapple with when you're looking at historical subjects, and a lot of times doing stories that maybe have been done but have missed something in the telling. So we'll come back in 5 minutes, and like I said, focus on historical doc making as a genre. So thanks everyone. Stay with us. We'll be back in 5.
Thank you.
Sorry. So sorry for that technical difficulty. In this next part of the conversation, we are going to focus on historical documentary making as a craft, because you have with you 4 experts in that field. And I think we'd all benefit greatly from hearing their thoughts on this specific topic. I'd like to start with Sam and Dawn, if that's okay, because I know that we don't have them for that much longer. Sam and Dawn, do you consider yourself historians?
No, I don't at all. No, I'm a filmmaker who has a passion for history, but not a historian. And the thing I would say is that, I love making historical docs. I mean, going back to Eyes on the Prize, going through Rise and Fall of Jim Crow, up through MLK FBI. So to me, it's always a pleasure to uncover these historic gems about our people and about our history. But the biggest challenge, quite honestly, with historical docs nowadays is the expense of archival footage. Archival footage has become so expensive, it is really killing us as filmmakers. It's really, really outrageous. And so that's the biggest challenge I have now as a filmmaker, trying to make sure I have a budget to pay for the footage. Dawn?
I agree with that, and I love historical documentaries. I have too much respect for historians to even begin to, think about myself as a historian. Right now, I'm executive producing the next iteration of Eyes on the Prize, so it's great to be here with Sam, and um, Sam, I hope he knows that he's going to help us. um, um, but Sam's right, and that speaks to there's 2 things I want to raise for this. One is um, we really need to pay attention to this expense, because to our earlier part of the conversation where we're talking about access and resources, if these historical films are getting so expensive to do that the networks are having pause on doing them, they're only going to go to a certain number of filmmakers to make them. Stanley, Sam, Roger, and I, can't make everything. And so there's a worry that we're not going to get them made. And so we really, really need to address this. And the networks who have benefited from the golden age of documentary and from people's interest in revisiting historical subjects have realized that they're, in the shrinking age of news budgets, that this is a good moneymaker. But they really need to work with us some more. So that's one thing. The other thing that also echoes back to a conversation we were having is, so I made a series about Bobby Kennedy, and what I said to Netflix when I made it, going back to who is the maker, is it's going to be the blackest Bobby Kennedy you've ever seen, because Bobby Kennedy was influenced by Black people. And that was something that came up early on in our research that had not been put out there for him. And so so that's why it's important to have multiple people telling stories. Like, I wasn't really looking for that. I had an access point through John Lewis, but it became so clear. Once you start to see it, you just see this is so obvious. He didn't jump out of his womb as a civil rights activist. He was pushed there by Harry Belafonte and Marian Wright Edelman and John Lewis and other young activists who were pushing him. And to his credit, he listened, but not without fighting. So that is also why the maker is important, because is often quite revealing about a person. So,
Mm-hmm. And
all
so,
history is Black history.
all history is Black history. Absolutely. All American history is Black history in particular. So now, for Sam and Don, you very clearly said we do not consider ourselves historians. Obviously, historians are an integral part of the practice. For all of you, how do you engage with historians and historical texts when you set out to make the films that you are interested in? Let's start with Stanley.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it really depends on the film. It depends on the story I'm telling, and it really mostly depends on the historian or historians. You know, some are have been incredible. When we did Freedom Riders, Ray Arsenault, who wrote the book, opened up his files. I mean, he had phone number and emails of of the 400 and something Freedom Riders. And he would contact. I mean, it was just incredible. Other times we work with historians, and they're kind of like, I'm kind of busy. And they're not so cooperative, and we have to just keep moving. So it really depends uh, on the individual historian and the story that we're telling. And we've told a lot of stories that there is no one text. So we did a film on HBCUs, and there was no. I mean, I was surprised that there was no book that was like, okay, this is the book on HBCUs. There's a book on education in the South before 1900. There's a book on Fisk. But we had to kind of piece it together.
Mm-hmm.
I've found that when I do a historical film, I'm trying two things. I'm trying to find historians that I think are going to be personally engaging, but who also know the history. But I'm also, if I'm trying to do a story where, for example, slavery by another name, I'm looking for people who can speak to somebody in their family from a few generations before who might have experienced something that happened to them, in terms of the Black experience. So I'm always trying to figure out stories who could be storytellers and not just give you information, but also looking for people who might have some connection to the story to give it a little more sort of drama and dynamics. So I'm always looking for those, trying to find those two things when I'm telling a historical doc. I mean, the perfect example for me was learning when I did Eyes on the Prize. One of the things that that enabled us was to find people who had experienced the civil rights struggles in the 50s, in the 60s, in Selma, in Montgomery, in Birmingham. And so when they were telling that story, you could feel the immediacy of what they experienced. And I'm always still looking for that when I'm working on a historical doc. I mean, when we did MLK FBI, we had Andy Young, we had other people who had been with Dr. King, besides a few historians, to just keep it, organic and dramatic, so it just doesn't feel like a complete history lesson.
Yeah. I think too, when we did the murder of Emmett Till, that was around 2000, and so we're talking about something that happened 45 years ago. But so many of the people involved were really young, and we realized that was a real sweet spot, and there's a sweet spot in history, where the footage looks old and it really looks good, but and the people are older, but they're talking about something that is incredibly important in their lives, and that they might have not gotten the chance to talk about before. So Attica is that thing, and Jonestown was that thing. Was we're talking to people who might have been the little old lady who's in front of you at the supermarket, and you're like, would you just hurry up? But they have this great story to tell. And that there's kind of some sweet spots in history, and it keeps getting later and later. So maybe now it's the 80s, but we really found that because it's not only history, but it's emotional history, and that's like in some ways the key.
I think one of the things that's so important about I thought I heard somebody. One of the things that's so important about history films is they speak to the time that you're living in, and hopefully you learn something about the time you're living in. So, when I'm listening to this, I'm thinking that in addition to reading everything, one of the things with a verite film is you don't know where it's going. You know that you have an interesting issue and you have a time period to follow, but you have to kind of like just be there and see it. Whereas with history, you can kind of figure out the facts. But, when I think about Slavery by Another Name, and Sam knows this because I went up to him at Sundance and I was like, how did you do that? Like, how did you do those recreations that just blew my mind? And he said, he told me how he did it, and like when you think like Stanley and Sam are saying, we had people who were there. I used that in Bobby Kennedy. I was like, there's too much material. The only people who were going to talk knew him, had touched him, had worked with him, like knew something about him personally. And it brings a different kind of immediacy. So we are also each other's resources because history is continuing and there's something new to say and something new to discover, especially if you look back and see like, okay, well, Stanley brought this to this point. When he made this film, this is what he was leaning into. Is there something else to say? And I think you really have to ask yourself, is there something else to say that you were ready to say, that you were ready to discover, and not just take a commission to do an anniversary movie? Like, I think that that's a mistake that people make is they just take the movie because it's offered instead of thinking like, how is this going to add to my skill and how is this going to add to people's enjoyment and understanding? But I just want to say, like, I think that those films that came earlier are part of our research in both storytelling style, but also information, and thinking about where you want to continue to grow that story. Because Stanley's not going to do Freedom Writers again. He did that already. He lived with that for how many years? So so there's opportunity there to say like, what can I add? How can I remind people and grow it? It's a continuum. It's not a left continuum.
And I just want to speak to that also. I mean, when I was in my hotel room about a year ago, Stanley, and I turned on Showtime, and I started watching Attica, and I had done a little segment on Attica for Eyes on the Prize back in 1986, and so I'm watching Stanley's show, and he did exactly what Dawn is saying. He took it to another level. I finished watching that damn film. I said, "Damn, man, this fucking." Excuse my language. I'm sorry. This film is really, really moving because when he went back to some of these gentlemen who had been in that prison, both white and black, and they're telling you their day-to-day experience, that takeover, that took it to another level. Oh man, took it to another level for that little 15-minute piece. I said, I called Stanley up and said, "Man, you knocked it out of the park, man." And that's what she's talking about. A filmmaker who brings their own vision to something that has been already done a bunch of times, but gives it another perspective, another level of nuance, another level of dimension that you say, "Wow!" It's like it was a fresh new story for me. It was fresh. I said, "Man, something." But I'm going to have to jump off after that now, and I really want to thank you for having me, Stanley. Thanks for inviting me. Great seeing you, Roger, Dawn, Cameo, as always. Enjoy the rest of the panel. Okay, take care.
Thank you. I know, Dawn, you have to leave as well.
Here. Yes, and thank you all. Thank you for including me. Really love to see everybody.
Thank you both. Thank you both.
Thanks.